The U.S. invasion of Grenada is one of those pages of history that is not usually talked about in the Army. The Grenadian army numbered 1,000 men against an invasion force that was 5 times larger in number, according to official data. However, according to other American data from the court, it was 30 times larger. Most listeners won't even be able to find this island in the Caribbean Sea without a search engine. A huge island, 344 square kilometers in area. To understand what that means, you can compare it to the area of a city with a population of 500,000 to 800,000 people. On the other hand, what was there to do? The country was in deep contemplation after Vietnam. Hollywood churns out heroic films about the exploits of U.S. Special Forces. The highly publicized landing of U.S. Marines in Lebanon ended with the deaths of 241 Americans, out of a total of 1,000 Marines, after a suicide bomber attacked their barracks in a truck bomb in October 1983. President Reagan, himself a former actor, clearly understood that a real victory was needed. Any victory? Where? Cuba? Quite possibly. Only such a victory would cost the U.S. not just 1,000 caskets. The Americans knew the might and spirit of the Cubans all too well. What was needed was a cinematic victory, with a minimum of American casualties, demonstrating American military might to the world, and using the most trained and publicized units. The Sandinistas in Nicaragua, leftist guerrillas in El Salvador, the overthrow of Eric Gary's government, and the rise to power of Maurice Bishop in Grenada. And everywhere there were Cubans, which meant the USSR too. From March 1979, Bishop began actively collaborating with Cuba and the USSR. He rearmed the army, making the new Grenadian army the most combat-capable in the Eastern Caribbean. Bishop signed 3 military agreements worth a total of $58 million with the Soviet Union alone. Even North Korea was supposed to supply Grenada with $12 million worth of military equipment under an agreement. In March 1983, the U.S. announced a boycott of Grenada. It banned tourists from visiting the island and conducted exercises near Grenadian territorial waters. Everyone understood that war was approaching. On March 26th, the Grenadian government put the army on combat alert and mobilized part of the police force. Numerous anti-government organizations began operating in the country. The Americans began preparing a conspiracy. But what most concerned Reagan was the construction of a new civilian airport at Point Salines. The fact was that such an airport would need a 3-kilometer runway to accommodate aircraft of all types, which meant it could also be used for landing military aircraft, including strategic bombers. The U.S. president repeatedly stated that under the guise of a civilian airport, Cuba and the USSR were building a new military base. Officially, an English company was in charge of the airport construction, but the construction workers were hired in Cuba. That's why Cubans were present on the island. According to some reports, there were 784 Cubans in Grenada, including 636 construction workers, 44 doctors and teachers, and 43 military personnel guarding the construction. The Cuban guards were only armed with small arms. But the army guarding the airport had heavy machine guns and Soviet 23mm automatic guns. So what did the operation look like on paper? Operation Urgent Fury envisioned a simultaneous landing of sea and air assault forces to seize administrative and military facilities. The north of the island was suitable for a sea landing, the south for an air assault. The main forces of both landing groups consisted of U.S. Rangers and Marines, with paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division supposed to exploit the success of the initial landings. Local U.S. supporters and aircraft conducted reconnaissance of the terrain and targets. At the final stage, reconnaissance and sabotage groups were to be airlifted in by helicopters. The forces the U.S. was sending to Grenada are very interesting. From the Second Fleet of the U.S. Navy, Army, and Air Force, 2 groups were formed, a carrier group and an amphibious group, consisting of 12 U.S. Navy warships. The carrier group included the aircraft carrier Independence and 6 escort ships. The Air Force contributed 8 F-15 fighters, electronic warfare EC-130 aircraft, 3 long-range radar aircraft, and nearly 60 military transport aircraft. The landing force numbered 5,000 men from 2 battalions of the 75th Ranger Regiment and 2 brigades of the 82nd Airborne Division. The amphibious group had 5 U.S. Navy ships. Over 3 dozen helicopters were used for the landing, as well as over 20 landing craft. The landing force was more homogeneous, consisting of the highly trained assault units of the 22nd Marine Amphibious Unit with heavy equipment and weapons. The operation was scheduled to begin at 5 a.m. on October 25, 1983. The pretext for the start of the amphibious operation was supposed to be a statement by American students about an attack and threat to their lives. So, journalists were only allowed on Grenada on the 28th, after the military had cleaned up after themselves. However, no matter how well you try to hide mistakes, specialists see them immediately. So let's talk about the mistakes. The most important target for the first wave of the invasion was the airport. That's where the famous Delta Force was thrown in. 35 Delta operators made a high-altitude jump and managed to land stealthily at the airport. However, the specs miscalculated. The Cuban fighters were experienced and managed to spot some of the paratroopers. And it began. 6 Special Forces soldiers were killed in the air. 22 were wounded. The rest were pinned down by fire on the runway and couldn't even raise their heads. The Soviet AK was head and shoulders above the Special Forces pistols and silenced rifles. They were only saved because they called in air support. It was precisely the strike-by-attack aircraft and helicopters that allowed the remaining operators to get away from the runway. The Rangers' navigation system broke down, and the whole group circled over the island searching for a place to land the troops. And they ended up flying right into Soviet DSHK heavy machine gun fire. A tried-and-true weapon, ideally suited for engaging paratroop aircraft. Panic broke out on the radio. We're under heavy anti-aircraft fire and changing course. In short, part of the paratroop force was dropped off in some remote corner of the island. Exactly where is unknown, but the fact that they were fighting there until the end of the operation is known. Against whom is unclear. And this incident only became known because after the operation, the paratroop command sued the Air Force. Though the case was hushed up, there were also the Navy SEALs, truly well-trained operators, specifically the Sea Base Group. But the command decided to use them as an assault unit for the landing force. 2 boats with teams of combat swimmers were supposed to be dropped from Hercules transport planes. The first drop ended in tragedy. The boat, together with its crew, instead of surfacing, submerged. There are no exact details about the fate of the crew, but it's clear that surviving such a situation is quite problematic. The second drop was successful. The boat surfaced. They even started the engine and headed for the shore. And, seeing some kind of ship, the SEALs decided to shut off the engine for the sake of camouflage and wait it out. They waited, but they were so intent on maintaining camouflage that they shut off the engine permanently. So the boat with the elite naval special forces bobbed around in the open sea for 2 whole days. Fortunately, a U.S. Navy ship was passing by nearby, but the SEALs did see some real action too. So in the north of the island, the special forces finally made it ashore and ran into vigilant military police. For over a day, the police let the combat swimmers smoke, not letting them leave the beach. The SEALs had a similar experience when freeing the British Governor-General Paul Scoon. 20 combat swimmers with light weapons came under fire from Cuban BTR-60 armored personnel carriers. They were chased quite a bit until attack aircraft rescued them. But the most interesting battle was for the Richmond Hill prison. Delta was supposed to rappel down from 6 helicopters and capture the prison. For the helicopters, there was only one way in between the prison and the garrison barracks. Grenada's army was just playing at war in this battle. A helicopter appears in the pre-sighted gap, with special forces descending by ropes. They were shot at like targets in a shooting gallery. And the machine gunners even shot down a helicopter. To speak more broadly, the Americans really did demonstrate the full might of their military. Whenever they met any resistance, even if it was just one person, entire units would successfully take cover and call in air support. These were not isolated incidents, but a widespread practice. And enshrined upon the headquarters of the Grenadian army, the U.S. fighters successfully attacked a nearby psychiatric hospital instead. There was another combat episode there, when for several hours, Rangers and Marines fired at each other. And in keeping with American tradition, both units called for air support. And they got it, friendly fire. And firing on one's own forces is not an isolated case for the U.S., but rather quite typical. Naturally, the information about losses also raises doubts. Officially, the Americans lost only 18 people killed. In addition, 116 people were wounded. Likewise, the losses of the opposing side are doubtful. The Cubans lost 25 people killed and 600 captured. The Grenadians, 45 killed and 24 civilians. The only truthful figure came from the Soviet Union. During the operation, the Americans twice fired on the Soviet embassy, supposedly by mistake. One embassy staff member was seriously wounded. So, one figure perfectly illustrates the scale of Operation Urgent Fury. Over 8,000 American servicemen were awarded decorations for this invasion of a tiny island.